Good.
Thank you. We're recording. All right, so I'll call the meeting to order of the General Plan Community Advisory Committee. I have taken care of the roll call, and if anybody comes late, I will go ahead and add them. Just one quick announcement under roll call is that committee member Eddie Flores has been appointed to the City Council. So congratulations to him. And he will no longer be on the advisory committee, but we're excited for him in his new role. The school district will be deciding on that appointment, I believe, at their next meeting. But we still do have alternate Pat Murray that is able to attend the meetings. So at this time, we'll take any public comment. If there's anybody that has any public comment, you can go ahead and raise your hand and make that comment now. I don't see any public comments at this time. I'll move to the consent calendar, which is the approval of the minutes from January 12th, 2021. Does anybody have any corrections or comments on the minutes? All right, would anybody like to make a motion?
I move that we accept the minutes as written.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. All those in favor, you can say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, the motion is passed. I'll hand it off now to Diana. I believe you'll be walking us through the new business item, and our discussion today is starting with a review of the Sea Level Rise Forum.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. And welcome, everyone. I'm sure you've noticed I'm not Eric Yurkovich. He's feeling a little under the weather today. My name is Diana Benitez, and I'm also with Ramey & Associates. Most of you may recognize me. I'm usually in this meeting in the background, furiously taking notes, but I'll be facilitating a bit today. And we also have my colleague, Sammy Taylor, joining us, and she's also for Ramey & Associates. And so, as Lisa mentioned, we're going to be taking some time at the beginning to debrief on the Sea Level Rise Forum from last month. Then we're going to have Sammy give us a bit of a primer on sustainability and climate change. And then we're going to have Sammy also talk on the sustainability policy framework. And then I'll finish up with a few next steps to let you know upcoming community engagement that we'll be having. And so actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can start with this. So if you remember last month, we had that Sea Level Rise Forum, and where we had 4 speakers. We had Dave Pine from the county talk about on the challenges of sea level rise for the county. Then we had Jeremy Lowe from the San Francisco Estuary Institute Aquatic Science Center, and he spoke about the adaptation atlas and how that applied to South San Francisco. Then we had Richard Mullane from Hassel Studio, and he spoke on the Coma Creek Connector project, and he also spoke about his work with the Resilient by Design work that they've been doing for a few years now. And then we had Mike Futrell, city manager, talk about how the city is preparing for sea level rise. And so we just wanted to take some time today, just at the start, because we know there was a lot of feedback, but we wanted to make sure that there was time for us to hear from you all. If you had any thoughts, any feedback, any questions on that forum that we had last month, please let us know.
I don't think I can't remember. I don't think I said anything during the forum, but just a general comment that I thought it was a good event. I thought it was really successful. I had advertised it to members of Genentech's Sustainability Council, as well as some others in the company that are involved in environmental health and safety, sustainability type issues, and a number of them did attend and also had positive things to say about it. So just wanted to pass that along. I think there was people were generally encouraged that this was something that people were actually, at the city, were actually thinking about.
Thank you for the feedback. We had about 61 folks attend.
That's great.
Anyone else? Any questions, any feedback, any ideas? Okay. Oh, yes, Christy.
Sorry, I thought it was really well done and really informative. I did notice, just based on the public comments, and even the presenters, there was sort of a lack of diversity as far as attendees. And I believe Eddie Flores had mentioned actually in his interview that for council that, there was sort of a lack of awareness / understanding of how global warming and climate change sort of impacts at the more granular level into our daily lives, the prevalence of stronger storms, things like that, what it sort of means to residents in South City, and how we can get that message out and, to the different populations here. I thought that was a really good point and maybe something we can talk about. I'm not sure if it's general plan, that's pretty granular there, but just something as a city we might want to think about.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. For the climate change point, we are starting up the climate action plan that actually Sammy and I are going to be working on. And one of the things, based on what Councilmember Eddie said, we also had, I know Eric and Billy spoke with him, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, but he also mentioned this. And so the primer that Sammy's going to be starting with is building off of that. And what we're also planning on doing, which I'll be talking more on the next step, but we're going to be creating primer videos so that folks can click to see on climate change and sustainability, like why that matters and what the bigger context is. Ones for equity, for transportation. And when we have our community meetings, those slides are also going to be included in our larger conversation, but we're going to have those videos to help people get oriented when we start. But thank you for that feedback. Anyone else?
Yeah, I thought it was a good mixture of kind of looking at the problems that we are going to face with sea level rise and things like that, and also some of the visionary interventions to bring people closer to experiencing the Bay again. So it was nice to see that part of what we were talking about is bringing the experience of like Colma Creek and the Bay back to people to enjoy.
Thank you. Good feedback. And I'm also realizing, Christy, for your first comment on lack of diversity, I think that's something we can look at when we have our next forum to make sure that we have more diverse presenters. And we've also been trying to have simultaneous interpretation in Spanish for all of these forums. And we've also been providing slides.
Great, thank you.
But we can, yeah. And thank you, Julianne. And was anybody else? All right, if not, I can pass it on to Sammy so we can get started on that sustainability primer and then jumping into that policy framework review. Okay, Sammy?
Thanks, Diana. Let me just share my screen with you guys. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so let me just make sure I get everything up so I can make sure I don't miss anything going on in the chat or anywhere else. All right. Okay, let's see, where are we? Okay, so as Diana mentioned, I'm going to be giving a pretty high level primer, I guess, on sustainability and climate change and really why that's important in South San Francisco. And then what can we do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and hopefully avoid kind of the worst case scenario when it comes to the climate impacts like sea level rise. So let's get started, and feel free, some of this gets kind of technical, so feel free if you don't understand anything or just need, more clarification to interrupt and ask questions as we go. Okay. So what is sustainability? Sustainability is really the ability to meet the needs of the present without compromising the future generations from meeting their own needs. And this is a definition that is from the Brundtland Commission, but it really captures the intent and the spirit of sustainability. And true sustainability is the intersection of the three topics you can see kind of in this diagram here. And it's people, planet, and profit, or prosperity in this case. And all three really affect each other, and doing something in one place really can have an impact on the other areas. And where they all kind of come together harmoniously is what we try and define as sustainable. So the importance of practicing sustainability has become even more of a priority as we see the potential impacts of climate change really affecting all three of these aspects of sustainability. And climate change is really part of the environmental sustainability realm, but changes to that also affect people and profit as well. Okay, very sensitive mouse. So stepping back a little bit, greenhouse gas emissions are what we have discovered are really the thing fueling climate change. And so climate change is caused by the increase in these greenhouse gas emissions, or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that trap heat and cause a warming effect. And that warming effect creates climate change. And that's really the disruption of historical, climate patterns that we've seen throughout history. So these are some of the most important GHGs that often are, when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about carbon dioxide, but we're talking about carbon dioxide equivalent, which is really a combination of all of these things. So over the last, few hundred years, few hundred thousand years, we've seen changes in greenhouse gas emissions. Some of them are naturally occurring, but what we've really seen since the Industrial Revolution is kind of human-induced climate change and a change in greenhouse gas levels. So this graph shows how we're seeing this large increase in atmospheric levels of these greenhouse gases. And these are kind of caused by several things. The combustion of fossil fuels is probably the most important one, as well as land use changes. And those have to do with agricultural practices, deforestation, and things like that. And so that's really causing this atmospheric warming that's leading to other changes in Earth systems and patterns. And these include patterns in weather events, so rainfall, snow, temperatures, melting of glaciers and ice, creating sea level rise, and also the warming of our oceans, and also chemistry changes in our oceans as well. So why is this important, and why is this important really in South San Francisco? So California and South San Francisco are already experiencing the effects of climate change, and both gradual with sea level rise, but also kind of immediate, like excessive heat days, poor air quality. We're also entering a new period of drought, which is something to keep in mind. So we already see these impacting kind of our daily lives and how we live. And we also know that these hazards disproportionately affect the most sensitive populations within the city. So in light of this, the state has been taking climate action really starting in 2006 with AB 32, but it passed SB 32, which extended the life of AB 32 to adopt emissions reduction targets for the entire state, which local jurisdictions are asked to really help contribute to. So SB 32 adopted the reduction targets of a 40% emissions reduction below 1990 levels by 2030 and an 80% reduction by 2050.
And Sammy, sorry, for that earlier slide, I just wanted to let folks know that when we mean vulnerable populations, we're talking about children and older adults, we're talking about low-income populations, people who don't speak English very well, people who lack health insurance, the people who live or work near fire, flooding-prone areas. We're also talking about communities of color. We're talking about renters, and we're also talking about populations with chronic and acute illnesses like asthma. Sorry, keep going, Sammy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So where are these greenhouse gases coming from? So primarily in a municipal setting like South San Francisco, transportation, energy use, so natural gas and electricity, solid waste, water, and construction and lawn and garden equipment are the main contributors to greenhouse gas emissions within the city. And so South San Francisco has been inventorying its emissions to kind of set a baseline and see, like we said, where are the emissions coming from? So it started in 2005 with its first, go ahead. Someone have a question? Okay. So it started in 2005, inventorying its emissions. And as you can see from this chart, transportation is the largest single sector at 38% of total emissions, but combined residential and non-residential energy is actually 45% of total emissions from 2005. So the city also conducted an inventory of their 2017 greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see it really follows the same trends. Transportation is still the largest sector at 44%. Residential energy and non-residential energy account for 41% of total emissions. And the baseline emissions rate for the service population of the city, so both residents and people who work in the city, was 4.5 metric tons of CO2 per year. So as you can see, it's really not much has changed, but this doesn't factor in, of course, joining PCE and having renewable energy or access to carbon-free electricity like we do now. And so we'll continue to see these emissions change, and that's really why we start inventorying these emissions so we can track how the city is progressing in its climate action goals. And it also allows us to see what we need to do in order to align with some of the state targets.
Sammy, I think Bill has a question.
Oh,
Sure, go ahead, Bill.
I had a question. This pie chart is specifically focused on South San Francisco?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
So this is South San Francisco's emissions.
I couldn't see if it was a city or a statewide emission footprint or a county. It's specifically South City. Okay, very good, thanks.
Yes, and same with the 2005
Right.
data as well. So these are important. So these inventories,
what is
do you have another
off-road?
question?
Yeah.
So off-road, off-road emissions are the construction and demolition equipment, as well as lawn and garden equipment. So everything from, the big backhoes to the leaf blowers that the gardener uses who takes care of people's landscaping.
Thank you.
So some of the most important things to kind of take away from these two slides is that greenhouse gas emissions are actually increasing in the city, and they increased 18% from 2005 to 2017. But taking into account, population growth and the growth of the city, the per service population number has only increased 3%. So that allows us to see that although, the city is growing, emissions are not growing at the same rate, which is really good news. We know transportation makes up the majority of community emissions, followed by non-residential energy use, and that we expect these, like I said, energy emissions to decrease with the transition to carbon-free electricity from PCE.
I have one question. Since 2005, the emissions, are these calculated on the same basis? The global warming potentials have changed, the methodologies for have changed. So when you're doing the comparison, are you revising the 2005 inventory to be on the same basis as the 2017?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually not sure if some parts of 2005 were re-inventoried to align with kind of the best practices that we're using today. But we can definitely look into that and make sure that, we are comparing those apples to apples and not apples to oranges from different methodologies.
Okay, thank you.
So like I mentioned before, and why this is really important, especially as we get into, like Diana said, development of the climate action plan down the road and kind of marrying that to the general plan, is the adoption of a greenhouse gas reduction target. So the state has set greenhouse gas reduction targets in order to slow, climate change and lessen the impacts of climate change. And this graph shows kind of where we are today and where kind of SB 32 needs us to be. So this is statewide. The 2020 target, which was set by AB 32, has been met. And now we're on our way to 2030, which is 40% below 1990 levels, and then 2050, which is 80% below 1990 levels. So in addition to that target option, former Governor Jerry Brown adopted, or didn't adopt, but put forth a executive order B5518, which really asked that the state consider and local jurisdictions consider becoming carbon neutral by 2045. So it's a bit stringent, more stringent of a target, a bit more ambitious with a shorter timeline, but that's really kind of where we see the state going in the future. Although it hasn't been formally, adopted and codified, we do see that happening probably sooner than later. And that's really the direction most cities and local governments are going in terms of what targets they're adopting for their greenhouse gas reductions. So we have to know kind of where we're going in order to know what those reduction targets would mean for South San Francisco. So this, we created this emissions forecast based on the preferred land use alternative for the city's general plan. And so as you can see here, we're expecting, the city to continue to grow, and we're only expecting emissions to actually increase 2%. As a result of this growth, but we're also counting the adjusted business as usual forecasts, and this takes into account some of the state programs and policies that are already in place that affect greenhouse gas emissions, like the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is all utility provided electricity will be carbon free by 2045. So we're already ahead of this with PCE. We already have that option. Title 24, which is the California Cal Green Building Code, which increases energy efficiency requirements and other building efficiency requirements every 3 years on a triennial cycle. Pavley's Clean Car Standards, which are important ways to reduce tailpipe emissions for vehicles. And a new one, which is SB 1383, which is the Short-Lived Climate Pollutants Act, which really tries to capture or reduce the amount of methane that is released into the atmosphere by curbing the amount of organic material that's sent to landfill. So we factor all of those policies into our forecast, and that's kind of what gets us to this 2% increase versus 2017, even though we're expecting kind of growth within the city. So knowing that, we have a gap to fill. So, we're not expecting an outrageous, amount of emissions, but we are expecting it to increase. And if we want to be able to reduce that, we have to close that gap. And so that's why we think about these sustainability policies, these climate action policies to get us to where we want to be. So I guess the first question though is, where do we want to be? We have a bit of a poll to see kind of how we all feel about these targets. And so if you have any questions, so far, or about any of the targets or about any of the inventory or forecasting, let me know. But which target, I guess, should South San Francisco choose? So I'm going to launch this poll, and we'll go through a couple of them so we can get a feel about which target we're leaning towards as a group. Okay. So take a couple
And we
minutes.
set it up, Sammy? Sorry, Sammy, we set it up so it's one by one, and it may help for you to go to that previous slide where you were explaining what each of these were. I know at one point you had AB 32.
Yeah.
And let us know if you need a reminder.
Yeah, so this one we're asking, should South San Francisco establish a target to achieve carbon neutrality? So that's one option. And so you can agree, strongly disagree, anything of that level. We'll give it another minute and we can.
And while you're doing that, I know Roderick has his hand raised.
Go ahead, Roderick.
Yeah, I just had, I'm sorry if you're going to get to this in a second, but a question about what the breakdown was for the forecast where we increased by 2%. Like, does that mean transportation is increasing by a lot, but something else is decreasing? Or?
Yeah, so I don't have that slide in here, but we can speak to that. Yes, so energy is going down in terms of, clean electricity being provided by PCE, which means the, transportation is going up. We also are expecting an increase in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, which has a direct correlation with emissions. But there are ways, obviously, to mitigate that increase by either using by what we're calling clean VMT, which is electrifying those vehicle miles traveled and then powering them with carbon-free electricity. But we can provide that breakdown, which we do have, just not included in the presentation. The other thing we'll start to see is since electricity is clean, the proportion of emissions that are now comprised of natural gas goes up. So we see that become a larger portion of the kind of the breakout of emissions. And then we also see some of the other, I guess, the off-road emissions do continue to grow. Since we're expecting more growth, we're expecting more construction within the city, and those are accounted for. And then water and waste generally stay about the same annually, but as the city grows and population grows, they go up proportionally as well. So I'm going to end this poll and we can see where we're at, and then we can launch the next one as well. Okay.
Sorry, one other question. Do these numbers take into account the airport and the emissions that the airport that is on our property as part of the city that puts out?
No, so the airport is not included as part of this emissions. This is like the community-wide inventory. So it more reflects kind of community emissions. The airport is kind of a special case. So it's not reflected in these numbers.
Okay, and then one on that note, a similar note, when we're talking about the commercial in particular output, is that just what's produced within the city limits, or is that also accounting for what the companies as a whole that are within our city are putting out as well, like their product impact?
Sure. So that's just what is produced within city limits.
Perfect. Got it. Thank
you.
I
guess the most of these emissions, just to kind of draw you a bigger picture, are what happens within the city boundaries. The only emissions that we count outside of city boundaries have to do with vehicle miles traveled. And the accounting is sort of silly, but you take 100% of the trips, of the emissions associated with the trips within your city, and you take half of the emissions from trips that are either originate in your city and end elsewhere, or originate elsewhere and end within your city. So that's kind of the only one where we go beyond the boundary a little bit.
I was just going to make a quick note on the airports. The airport, like the runways and that's where the airplanes are actually taking off from, that is not within South San Francisco. Some of the like United Maintenance Terminal, some of the long-term parking, those types of uses are within, and those would have been included. But the portion that's creating the greater amounts is not within South San Francisco's boundaries.
Sure. So again, any of the commercial buildings that were in the city are counted, but the general airport operations are kind of a special case. Okay, so there seems to be some great support in terms of adopting a target of carbon neutrality. That's really great. Let's launch the next poll, and then we can see kind of how we compare across the different targets. Okay. Oh, is this the same one? There we go. Sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. So this one gives us a date. So being consistent with Executive Order B5518, should we try to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045? Okay, we'll give it another minute here.
One question about non-residential. What it's like natural gas usage, or is that like electrical usage, or
Both, yeah.
do we know like the proportion of each? Like if everything is clean electric, like do we still have a bunch of people using natural gas for steel, or I don't know what all they use it for.
Yeah, so I mean, that's something we can talk about when we get kind of into the policy framework. But yes, so we have, we look at energy use, both electricity and natural gas. And so we really, we get that data from the utilities. So anything that's purchased and used within the city, we see reflected in our numbers. So yes to both. Okay, great. So we have more agreement, 2045. Seems like a good year. And then I think we have one more that I want to share with you and get some feedback on. Okay, so this one we've moved the date up and are looking at carbon neutrality by 2040, and that's consistent with the general plan time horizon and puts us ahead of state targets.
Sorry, like one more question while we're waiting. Do we have targets for like particulate matter too? I mean, we have greenhouse gases, but there are other emissions from fires.
Sure. So the air quality management district sets a lot of those targets already. So we are usually trying to be in compliance with those. But of course, reducing fossil fuel consumption, especially reducing, fossil fuel use in vehicles, will have a dramatic impact on particulate matter in the air. But the air quality management boards are usually the ones who set those targets for everyone. Okay, so I'm going to share these results. Oops. Okay, so it looks like we have some agreement with this. And also some people who have a neutral opinion on it. Does anyone want to share why they voted one way or another, or if they have a strong opinion about which target they would like the city to explore more fully?
I think it would be a good idea for Jenny to start. I saw a comment earlier. She mentioned focusing not just on becoming carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And so, Jenny?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the reasons that I've gotten involved in, paying a lot of attention and really excited about the general plan is because of my past working with climate activism groups and scientists, scientific groups like the Climate Foundation. The thing is, the situation is, as you know, it's a lot more dire than even what our most currently most strong approaches to and solutions are able to deal with. So, for instance, most of the heating that we have seen thus far and that we will see into the near future is from greenhouse gases that were put into the air, over the past 100 years. We haven't even begun to see the heating that's going to be caused by what we've put out in recent years. So I think it's really important as we're moving forward that all communities start thinking in terms of going carbon negative, not just carbon neutral. And I'm talking, of course, net negative. Obviously, we'll still be producing GHGs, but there are more and more ways that we're seeing to be able to start carbon sequestration. I would just like to put a quick plug in for seaweed as an amazing carbon sink that's in existence now. But really, I think it's very good to go with the most aggressive targets that we can. And then, yes, start thinking even farther than that.
Thank you, Jenny.
Great.
Would anyone else like to add anything?
Yeah, I think it doesn't hurt to be aggressive since it's such an incredibly important issue and frankly, a big challenge to achieve. So we might as well shoot as high as we can or slash as low as we can. And if we get there in 2045 instead of 2040, so be it. But let's, try our hardest.
Okay, great. All right. So that's great feedback. Thank you all. Okay, and we can provide more detail about the GHG inventory and the forecast. It definitely will be included in the climate action plan, but we can also, if you guys are interested, provide more detail into kind of the further breakdown of the sectors and of total emissions too. Okay, so we've seen that, we're emitting greenhouse gases into the air just by, living our lives in South San Francisco. And the city is aware of that. And so they have been working on it. Their climate action plan is from 2014. And so we'll just review now some of the existing plans and policies that the city has in place to really work through these issues. So like I mentioned, the city adopted a CAP in 2014 that includes climate mitigation measures. And it's also adopted several plans to address mobility issues. Some of them are relatively new and really exciting. MWELO deals with water use in the city, so especially outdoor water use efficiency. It's the model water efficient landscape ordinance to address water use efficiency. And they have a tree, they've considered tree health and preservation through the urban forestry master plan and the tree preservation ordinance. And then on kind of the flip side, they've also looked at climate adaptation through the Resilient South City policy and plan, and then the South San Francisco assessment of vulnerable properties and livelihoods. So they're really taking a good look at kind of the existing conditions and then planning around those. And so a couple more important programs to note are, joining Peninsula Clean Energy, which is probably one of the most impactful moves that the city could make in terms of reducing emissions, especially opting in at the 100% carbon-free tier, and then trying to maintain that level throughout the city. They've started providing mobility options like bike share and placing EV chargers throughout the city. They're also have some other sustainable programs like the seasonal farmers markets and the community garden, which is another way to not only encourage sustainable behaviors, but also to, when we get, as I'm sure you've heard when you talked about climate hazards and adaptation, like you're building that community fabric, and that can be really important in terms of creating a resilient future, as well as creating kind of buy-in for these sustainability programs. So they're creating opportunities to really grow that, social capital, which can be used to kind of promote these other programs throughout the future.
Just as a point of clarification, I believe Lime Bike is no longer operational in South City.
Right, we stopped that before the pandemic. It didn't work out.
But it's an example of the types of programs that help. Yeah, like that one didn't work itself, but
sure.
The things are the kind of things we need to do to help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just promoting, a bicycle and pedestrian network is another way to do it as well, and exploring options, trying things out and using those pilot programs is another way to keep progressing in this through these challenges. So kind of in conjunction with that, the team has been doing some outreach along these topics as part of the general plan work, and really we've heard, what have we heard so far? So the main themes are that we've heard is that the community would really like the city to become an environmental leader. They would like, access to public transit, improved safety for active transportation, so biking and walking, a more connected network of those trail systems, improved parks and open spaces, revitalizing Colma Creek, and really more of what we've heard is a reconnection to nature. So bringing back biodiversity into the city, making sure that the ecosystems are healthy, and then making sure that people can live among them, and make sure that they can, visit them, walk along the Bay Trail, and really experience, like you guys were saying with the Sea Level Rise forum, really experience this great, unique part of living in South City. So that's what we've heard. We've also heard that it's important to protect and enhance the historic and cultural resources throughout the city, and that we need to focus on not only climate mitigation, but also addressing the climate threats that we're already seeing kind of start to play out.
One question I had is, and maybe it's backing up a slide, on the existing programs. I am aware that the South City Scavengers have a anaerobic digestion system that they do to capture the methane off. Does that get factored in here? It seems to me you're displacing the amount of fossil fuel, the net fossil fuel the city is using. So shouldn't that also be captured somewhere?
Sure. So yes, theoretically. It depends, I guess, where that would, since it's I would say it's more a municipal operational related emission, it would be captured in a municipal inventory. But yeah, we'll actually talk about that as we move forward into the policy framework and exploring kind of more options for capturing those gases, and then also kind of creating other benefits around that. So thank you for bringing it up, because it's also still a relatively new strategy that a lot of waste haulers are starting to look into. So it's great that the scavengers are pursuing that.
For any one of the existing programs in general, is there a hurdle or whatever it may be in terms of like expected impact in terms of greenhouse emissions or carbon neutrality, like how far it gets us along the lines of getting closer? I mean, obviously every single one can be hard to measure, but like, is there a general hurdle rate that's there in place?
So we haven't actually done any of the kind of greenhouse gas quantitative analysis in terms of what the mitigation measures will actually achieve in terms of reductions. That will be the next step when we get into the climate action plan process. But yeah, we'll start to look at what the impact is of particular measures. And then that's one of the ways that we can kind of prioritize what the city should focus its resources on in the future. So we haven't done that yet, but it will be coming. Okay, so that kind of brings us to this sustainability policy framework that we've been talking about at a high level. So each of these topics, and this is kind of we took the general plan elements and Lead for Cities, which is a sustainability framework that focuses not only on climate change, but on sustainability as a whole topic. And we kind of were looking to see, where do these topics fit into the general plan framework. And so each of the above topics are actually going to be integrated into the appropriate general plan element. For example, stormwater and biodiversity are included in the conservation element. Low carbon mobility measures will be included in transportation and land use. And the creation of low carbon communities that encourage walking and biking are also in transportation and land use. E-mobility measures, for example, will be in mobility. So there's a lot of crossover on these topics and where they fit into the general plan framework. So what we're going to talk about today is these specific topics. And these are topics that are not covered necessarily already in an existing general plan element, but ones that we will fit in to these general plan elements, if that makes sense. Okay. So you can see we have new buildings, building retrofits, solid waste, purchased energy, so resilient and fossil fuel free energy, and carbon sequestration. And so based on this, you know, we identified these sustainability outcomes kind of based on, you know, the outreach that has been done and conversations with the city. And these are kind of the four that we've decided are something worthwhile to look into. And that's South San Francisco becoming an environmental leader, reducing energy and water use, increasing waste diversion, especially focusing on organics, and then becoming carbon neutral by 2045. Maybe we change that to carbon neutral, you know, no later than 2045, seeing if we can align with the general plan time horizon of 2040. And so in order to you know, measure how well we're doing against these outcomes, we established these sustainability performance metrics and targets to measure our progress. So we can see here greenhouse gas emissions continuing to inventory to see how well our, you know, climate action measures are working, reducing energy use by 20%, reducing water use. The target is still TBD. The state is working out new standards for jurisdictions across the state, so those will be adopted once we know, and then working towards the goal of zero waste. So just a quick note on transportation. I know it's really important in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and climate action plans, but we're actually going to be dealing with that as part of the land use and transportation element and not part of this kind of sustainability policy framework. So we won't really be talking about it today, although if you have, you know, comments or questions, please feel free to ask. But it is being considered as part of the other elements of the general plan. But like I mentioned, they're really the two main strategies, and that's clean VMT and reduced VMT. And we're thinking that a combination of those will help us bring down, you know, the transportation emissions, which account for the majority of the city's emissions. Okay, so we have, you know, green new buildings. So we have new construction and we have existing buildings, and new construction is really the easier of the two to deal with. So we want to make green buildings the standard in South San Francisco for new construction and major renovations. And those terms, you know, major renovations is something that can be defined later on in the process. The city probably already has a definition of that in its code that we can work from. So in order to create this, you know, ideal, the city would need to adopt, you know, a series of ordinances that improve the performance of new construction. Some of these examples include all electric reach codes, retrofitting of existing, you know, water fixtures in major renovation projects, installing solar panels on new construction, also establishing a streamlined approval for battery storage systems, also solar plus storage systems like that. And then one thing that we're seeing also is becoming a trend is establishing, you know, a streamlined process for approving gray water systems. And these are more of like the laundry to landscape, smaller systems, but then also allowing others to explore kind of larger scale gray water treatment systems in private development. Okay, so I'm sure you guys have heard about this emerging best practice. And this is kind of the most extreme example is Berkeley's ban on natural gas. And so what the city of Berkeley has done is banned natural gas hookups in new construction. And the reason that they did this is they cited it as a public health hazard. So we've kind of seen a pretty big spectrum of where these reach codes are falling, Berkeley being kind of the most stringent. We're seeing all electric reach codes and electric preferred reach codes. And that means you're really incentivizing buildings to be all electric and making it more difficult for mixed fuel buildings to be code standard. So the benefits of these, you know, are pretty numerous, but I guess the two biggest ones are that new all electric homes are more affordable and cheaper to build. And also it has improved air quality and health indoors as a result of the, you know, no fossil fuels being combusted within the house. So the second emerging practice is, you know, on-site non-potable water use. So this is the San Francisco's, the PUC's living machine. And so that actually treats black water So water that's used in the building, and it treats it to a gray water reuse standard. So that means that it's not potable, but you can use it for any non-potable use. So irrigation, toilet flushing, things like that. So the benefits of this are you're decreasing your potable water use, and as a result, you're reducing your water bills. They're also decreasing the amount of stormwater and wastewater that's being sent to their wastewater treatment plant and in their sewer systems. And they're also reducing the energy and chemicals that are needed to treat the water. The Living Machine is a bioremediated, system. So it does so naturally. It breaks down black water to gray water naturally without using chemicals. So that's one of the more ambitious and more exciting things that we're starting to see. And not only at this kind of building scale, but we're seeing smaller scale systems being installed in restaurants, not only as a way to reduce water use, but as a way to handle organics as well. Okay, so the second half of the buildings coin is existing buildings. And so, reducing emissions in existing buildings and also making them, more livable and habitable and healthier places for people to be. We're looking at establishing energy and water efficiency upgrade programs to help people, improve the performance of their existing building, and then also focusing those resources on the most underserved populations. One thing that we've really noticed is that the people who often use the incentives are the ones who really need them the least. So they're great tools for everyone to use, but we want to make sure that we can, everyone has equal access to those tools and is aware of them and that they're options. Roderick, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question about the phasing out natural gas use. So yeah, I mean, I like just from a public safety point of view, like after the terrible tragedy in San Bruno, I think it would be fantastic to be removing natural gas guns from the city. But I've heard of like a death spiral situation that goes on where once like the richer part of the population starts to, go to induction and remove the gas lines, then the price of natural gas will start spiraling upwards and becoming more expensive, and then more people leave and so on until nobody's using it. But that implies that last population is paying a lot for natural gas. Like, do we have that probably fits in with your equity angle that you were talking about?
Yeah. So I hadn't heard that theory before, but when you think about it, it may be how that works. However, I will also say that less so in PG&E territory, but I'm down in LA and in SCE and the gas company territory. The gas company has been very active in, dissuading people that natural gas should be taken out of buildings. So there's a lot of information out there that isn't necessarily true, but also could happen. So one of the things that I'll talk about next, and we can just talk about it now, is San Francisco is working out their natural gas phase out plan. And part of that plan is to develop tenant protections. So as gas is phased out and as, property owners are required to retrofit their buildings, there has to be some protections for, tenants and renters that allows for some pass through of cost, but also doesn't displace them as tenants. So I guess, this existing buildings is a much harder animal to tackle, and there's a lot of unknowns in this particular sector. But a lot of people are thinking about this and trying to, come up with solutions that protect, not only property owners and make it easier for them to transition, but protect people who live or rent space in these buildings. Okay, so a couple other things. So phasing out of natural gas, but also,
Actually, quick question on the natural gas bit. Like the whole concept of phase out natural gas is predicated on the idea that you pair all retrofits and new builds with solar, right? Like that, it has to be kind of like hand in hand. Otherwise, like the idea, the cost ends up being quite high for people that are living on a month-to-month type of paycheck situation. Is that right?
So it can be. So you can definitely pair, solar with any building, both existing and new. But since you guys are members of Peninsula Clean Energy, you have access to carbon-free electricity already. So it only makes sense really to transition away from gas if you have a clean alternative. And cleanest would be, the 100% renewable or 100% carbon-free electricity that the CCA provides. So it makes sense to talk about it here in South San Francisco, since you have access to that without having to install, solar panels on every single home. Although that also would provide, has resiliency benefits, cost, benefits, a whole lot of other benefits that are important to think about that aren't greenhouse gas reductions. So then we get into this kind of idea of what are the co-benefits of some of these measures, and that helps us also to prioritize, what's important to the city and what we want to see both in this policy framework and in the climate action plan. Okay, so back to kind of phasing out natural gas. So San Francisco has kind of spent the most time crafting these policies, and it's what a lot of cities are looking for as the kind of the model language and the model about how to do this. And so they've kind of taken this approach that, all buildings will be zero emission by 2050. So they have a deadline. And then they're also asking for, things to be phased in slowly, that equipment, when it needs to be replaced, has to be replaced with an electric alternative. So let's say it's 2025, your water heater dies, you're going to be asked to look for an electric replacement rather than a natural gas boiler. And so then they're also adopting a policy that will require large commercial buildings to submit a decarbonization plan. So they're not forcing it on people, but they're asking people to start thinking, what will it take to make this building, carbon free and make it all electric by 2035. So they're asking people to have thought about that, have a plan, and then make sure that it can be implemented by 2050. So this is kind of the strategy that a lot of cities are looking at in terms of how to deal with this issue in existing buildings. But we're all open to ideas, and ideas not only about what these policies should look like, but what incentives could be put in place to help ease that transition. What financing mechanisms are available or haven't been created yet, but could be to help this along. So it's a really place of emerging discussion and challenges and solutions. So we're all really excited to see how we can make this play out kind of the most equitable way, but also as effectively as possible. Okay, so then taking a step back from buildings, but really in order to make these buildings as efficient as possible, we need a resilient and fossil fuel free energy system. So the purchase energy that goes into our homes and buildings, what does that look like? And so we're thinking that, providing energy resilience free backup energy systems, microgrids, solar plus storage projects, also looking at community solar projects. So rather than having, solar panels on every single home, you may have them off-site, but a large enough scale, installation that could power an entire neighborhood. So looking at, different levels and different scales of implementation in order to achieve these goals. So working with PG&E in San Mateo County to develop a plan for building publicly accessible EV chargers, working with PCE and maintaining that high level of participation at the 100% renewable rate, partnering with PGE to, if we can't, immediately phase out natural gas, how can we make natural gas, one, safer, and two, kind of reduce those fugitive emissions that we see through the distribution of the natural gas throughout their system, and then working with PG&E to minimize the impacts of the public safety power shutoffs. And so kind of the emerging best practice in this area is the idea of microgrids. And so they are self-sufficient kind of closed loop energy systems that often have, a discrete geographic boundary with them. So they have a certain, neighborhood, or in terms of city operations, critical city facilities that they serve. and they contain both energy generation and energy storage, and often integrate with the heating and cooling. And so the benefits of this are, a resilient system that can provide energy when the grid is down. It reduces grid congestion and improves stability, but also is lower cost and clean, since you're often using, micro turbines or solar panels to source this energy. And so Berkeley is looking into microgrids. Some other cities are also looking into these as well. Western Riverside Council of Governments down here in Southern California has a program. So it's really, an emerging practice that we're starting to see play out in real time. So moving on to solid waste, like we said, the goal for the city would be to become zero waste, and that has to do with focusing on organics. So not only that, organics are being picked up through curbside collection, but that we're maximizing recycling service and maximizing participation in existing programs, but also developing a robust educational program to really make sure that we're encouraging all residents, especially multifamily and commercial uses, to participate in these programs, and also taking a step back and reducing and reusing what we have before we get to recycling. Another option would be creating a green purchasing policy for the city. And then, like you mentioned, Bill, not only using anaerobic digestion to reduce methane, but to capture and reuse the methane gas that's generated at the Oyster Point landfill. And so before we get into the best practice for that, I also want to touch on carbon sequestration. So the vision would be to increase carbon sequestration in open spaces and in the urban forest through marsh enhancement, so along Colma Creek, and tree planting. But also, I guess now we should also explore kind of aquatic solutions, seaweed, seagrasses as well. I think that's a great idea. So this would be implementing the city's urban forestry master plan, expanding existing marsh and wetland habitat, and then applying organic material to available land areas. So this emerging best practice is actually from a project we worked on, the San Luis Obispo's Climate Action Plan, and they have what they've called kind of their circular economy. So the city collects its organic waste, takes it to its city-owned anaerobic digester, which is what you see here in the picture. And then they use the soil amendment that is the byproduct of the anaerobic digestion to apply to their open spaces as a form of carbon farming and carbon baking. So they've really created something that, was waste and now is not only, serving to sequester carbon, but also helping to enhance and improve the ecosystems of their open spaces. So that's kind of what we're seeing is these, closed loop systems where we're not only making one thing go away, we're making another thing better. So that's really the emerging best practice that kind of marries those two sectors. So finally, we have water and wastewater. And so the vision here is to make wastewater treatment plant operate more efficiently. So this will be to, upgrade pumps to the most efficient models to reduce energy use at the wastewater treatment plant, and also explore opportunities to capture and reuse gas generated by the plant. So that's kind of what we see here. And I know the city is also exploring using the plant to treat organic waste as well. So that's another kind of best practice that we're seeing in this space.
Sorry, real quick. I just wanted to circle back real quick before I moved on from the solid waste. One other thing I want to make sure is on our radar is I don't believe that at this point that South City scavengers can process like industrial composting. I don't believe they have an actual industrial composting facility, and that can result in very easily people purchasing things that they think are compostable, putting them in the compost bin, they end up in the trash, which actually can break down into methane and be worse. So if we can also have on our radar trying to connect with an industrial composting operation, I know Google has like industrial composting option that they use for all of their plastics that they have. So if we can get some of that in there, I think that would be extremely helpful and also increase education around that.
Definitely. Thank you. That's a great suggestion. We're actually planning to connect with South City Scavengers sometime in the near future, so we'll be able to get more details about their current operations and systems, and kind of what might be on their radar for future, infrastructure improvement. So that's a great suggestion. Okay. So really quickly, just, what's next for some of wastewater treatment and water supply. We know that access to potable water is going to become increasingly important as we see these climate change impacts start to play out more. So how can we build resiliency into our water supply? And what the city of LA is currently working on is they're taking their largest water treatment plant and using it not only to treat water, but to provide purified recycled water and really meet, I guess, up to 1/3 of the city's water demands. And so they're using a whole variety of techniques. Some of them are being, are pilot programs at this plant, but the goal would be to build this local water supply and provide resiliency to the city's, water supply and help meet future demand. And it's kind of a two-step process. They will purify the water and then actually put it into local aquifers that will further clean the water and then serve a larger territory of users. So I know that was a very, a lot of information to come at you all at once, but we'd really love some feedback on some of these, topics, outcomes, strategies. So first I want to ask if there are any other questions or any other, comments about what was presented, and then we can get into the discussion. Okay, well, if you think of anything, just, feel free to ask. But I guess let's just start here at the top. So, we talked about outcomes and sustainability goals, but are there other outcomes to consider? I can go back up to the outcomes slide and we can see this is what we're thinking about so far, but is there anything that we're missing?
And as a reminder, this won't be your last opportunity to give feedback. This is a starting point. When I talk later on in next steps, we're going to have an interactive document similarly to how we had it for the preferred land use. And so you'll be able to type comments in directly there and attend community meetings. Stephen added something in the comments. Would you like to expand on that, Stephen?
Yes, hi. Hopefully you can hear me. Sorry, I'm having technical issues, but I just had a question, and if it's already covered, you can just help reiterate. Similar to recycle and compost programs that are happening, any thoughts about rain capture type of program opportunities that may make sense, at least for residentials? I don't even know commercial. Any thoughts around that?
Sure, so that's definitely something to explore. In terms of scale, residential, if that's something that the city would like to really include as a priority, there's ways to build that into kind of some existing policies. I mentioned MWILO before, and the city can really, as long as anything that they include in the policy beyond state requirements is more stringent than the state, they're allowed to put it in. So by asking people to, do rainwater harvesting in their garden or create, rainwater capture elements of their landscaping, that's something they can look into. At a commercial scale, it may be more difficult to implement, seeing as there's often less opportunity to capture kind of rainwater on commercial facilities. However, it's also something that the city can look into exploring with the water purveyor. They probably have some existing programs and incentives for rain barrels and things like that. So there's definitely an opportunity to look into it some more.
Stephen, this is Billy. I just wanted to add on. We're having these discussions with internal city departments as well. And we talked with Public Works and Engineering, and that was actually an item that some of their staff talked about. Like the city just needs to do, some of this is just outreach and education. And this is something that's probably a relatively easy thing to just have more of that outreach on and give people where they could do some of these types of things, and that could become more of a reality throughout the city.
Appreciate that. Yeah, partially because with the whole drought, aspect lingering on, it seems like every bit that we can grab and repurpose seems to be an opportunity to be aware of. But I appreciate it.
Do we have any sort of goals or tracking about like native habitat? Because I think like the tree plan is great, and a lot of the like marsh restoration, but those things can like go in different ways. And so like, if everyone's planting a eucalyptus tree, that's obviously not as great for our native birds and bees and stuff as it is if like people are planting oaks or other native species.
I can talk on that. So to the point of that first chart that Sammy had shared, this is related to conservation. And I wrote the conservation policy framework, and I definitely have protecting endangered, not only wildlife, but also plant species. And we connect a lot to the existing city's urban forest master plan and the parks master plan. And that's in that framework, we also focus a lot on emphasis on the ecology of not only the bay, but also of Colma Creek. And so, yeah.
Just to chime in there too, thanks for reminding me, Roderick. This also goes to a conversation that we were having yesterday, which is regarding private property, because a lot of our natural habitat is on private property. I just wanted to speak to that and point out that I've been gardening and doing a lot of work on my hillside behind my house for the past 2 years. I've been identifying plants as I go, and I've found a total of 1 native plant amidst all of the others. Everything else on my property that I've found in terms of the shrubbery has been an invasive, or at the very least on the watch list. That includes, there's invasive types of lilies, oxalis, there's the yellow oxalis that's all over the place. So being able to tackle that and maybe loop in the private property owners on that as well can be helpful in establishing, getting rid of the invasives and establishing the natives.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think right now the way I have the framework set up is potential for any new development for them to make sure that if they are planting, that they are species that are native to the area and removing any of those invasive species. And the other thing I did want to note is that the city is also, with the support of the county, they're continuing to build on this. But as you point out, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of all the medians and things along the side that I know are managed by the city, one thing that might be a simple solution or a simple help is when they're mowing down the brome grasses on the side that I know Parks and Rec does, if they just get mixed native seeds and scatter them at that time, we could start introducing some of those to counter the brome grasses that are growing there.
Sorry, like one more thing quick. Can we ban the sale of invasive plants in the city, or are there statutes to do that? Like I go to Trader Joe's and they're selling like English ivy there, which I know is like a huge because I like walk through the forest and it's just everywhere.
Billy, Tony, Lisa?
We can research how something like that could be implemented.
Yeah, you usually need to tie it to some health and safety findings, like the banning of e-cigarettes. I think they were able to kind of tie that to health and safety. But that's an interesting topic to explore.
When we're looking at these like sustainability outcomes and we say, oh, South City as an environmental leader, like what an environmental leader to who? Like regionally or to the state or to the world? Because is it enough to say, oh, we're an environmental leader, but we're going to be carbon neutral by 2045? Like, is that enough leadership? And kind of what are we, I don't know, what are the ways that we're defining this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we can, we can define that however we want. How we've kind of defined it to up to this point in the policy framework is that South San Francisco will be a regional environmental leader. Actually, I have the text right here. I can just read it to you guys. By acting decisively and inspiring other communities to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to climate change, and ensure a just transition. So that's kind of how we're framing it, but we can, change that language, think about that language a little bit more. I think that if you were to adopt a target for the climate action plan and in the general plan of carbon neutrality or carbon negative by 2040, that is definitely ambitious and wouldn't be easy to achieve. So that's something that is definitely on the kind of beyond kind of what we're seeing in Menlo Park, which is carbon neutral by 2030, we're seeing everything around the 2045, 2035 maybe timeframe. So 2040 really sits in that, you're pushing the envelope, you're going beyond what the state is asking, and really setting, you're really making a statement that this is important and a priority to the city. But I think, that's a question. Is that aggressive enough? Is it too aggressive? How do people feel?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems appropriately aggressive just based on tonight's conversation about things. But I think having this conversation without talking about, or, saying oh, but transportation, we're going to deal with in other parts while also recognizing it's the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases is kind of hard. And I don't know if there's a way when this is put into the general plan that it's at least address that, look, we know this is the biggest thing. And I don't know from a policy perspective, if it would be maybe innovative for us to just attack transportation with full rigor and make that the focus. And that's the way we become an environmental leader, is that we have amazing transportation and connections. I don't know. I know it's maybe not the most holistic approach, but maybe it would be the way to achieve this environmental leadership goal that we're looking for. I don't know.
I mean, I like what you're saying. I think one thing I've been thinking throughout this is to really reflect on this area, you almost need to have 5 different sections of the general plan side by side and consider the implications across each one. But I like the idea of potentially going after one very deeply, but open to other thoughts as well.
Similarly to Echo, there's so many things we can focus on. We have limited capacity. So what's going to be the one that's going to be the biggest bang that's going to knock out the 80% of the issues, ideally. So yeah, I appreciate that point.
Yeah. So I can also just add in a little bit here. So I think that's a great point. One of the things that becomes really challenging, especially when we deal with transportation, is really when we're trying to craft these policy frameworks and these plans, is we're looking at where does the city have direct control. So we know that in terms of, climate planning, especially, we have direct control over the building code, so how buildings are made. We have direct control over, the city's rights of way, what's being planted in those, how we're managing those. but we don't have direct control necessarily over the choices that people make. So we can try and influence them to take transit or walk, but we can't actually yank them out of their car and put them on the street. But we can kind of create these regional partnerships to make those choices, you know, to influence those choices a little bit more strongly in one direction or the other. But then, you know, transportation is such a regional issue, and I'm sure Diana can speak to a little bit more, that it's one of those things that the city can impact, you know, influence through their land use decisions, but we also know that the timeline and the time frame of that is much longer than, say, if we were to install EV chargers to make those, you know, encourage people to buy an electric vehicle versus walking the bus or taking the bus. So we just, you know, I think it would be, and that's kind of what the land use and transportation chapter is doing. It's taking those larger, you know, issues of land use decisions that, you know, take kind of decades to play out. 2040 is the horizon year. So we're looking at, you know, how can we have these different kind of, you know, different short-term, long-term, medium-term, long-term impacts throughout the way as we get to these land use changes. So I think it's really important to continue to recognize transportation. And like I said, transportation will be included in the climate action plan. So just in the, like, which will be a different document with specific strategies and measures and goals related to climate action specifically. But the general plan is, you know, has a very specific set of framework of elements and frameworks, so it will be addressed there in that. But it's also a great time to, you know, if there are goals or you know, things you would like to see, to make sure that when those topics come up that you are expressing them.
Yeah, I had kind of a similar reaction on transportation. I like the idea of kind of going big on something. It's true that, you know, a lot having to do with transportation is outside of the city's control. To some extent, that can actually work in our favor because, you know, the state and the federal government, depending on who's in charge, has enormous power over fuel efficiency in automobiles and can do a lot to move the needle on what vehicles are even available to people by certain timeframes. So especially, you know, in California, that can do a lot on its own without the city having to do anything at all. In the spirit of kind of the tough nuts to crack, and really, you know, trying to be a leader. I think dealing with existing buildings is one of the trickiest things out there. I mean, if you think about, you know, aside from transportation, they're, you know, way up there in the pie chart, both residential and non. And even if you think about, I mean, think back to our land use map where we highlighted the areas where we expected change to occur. It was actually a very small percentage of the city. There's not going to be, you know, as a percentage of sort of the total building stock, that much more new development relative to what's already there. Certainly some things will get redeveloped, but, you know, the swaths of residential neighborhoods that are not going anywhere, right? A huge percentage of the building stock is not going anywhere. And for all the reasons that we discussed earlier, phasing out natural gas, all that kind of stuff is hard. I mean, again, we have a leg up because South San Francisco participates in Peninsula Clean Energy, but that doesn't get you all the way there. And for non-residential properties, which you know, tend to be larger emitters, it can be even more challenging. And I think, you know, I like the sort of emerging best practices that you presented. And I don't know about the rest of you, but to me, the one that really jumped out was the one focusing on phasing out natural gas in existing buildings. That just struck me as kind of both the hardest thing to do and the one that would have to involve sort of the greatest buy-in from most of the population. It's one thing to sort of retrofit your sewage treatment plant. Like, that's great. The average person doesn't impact the average person, right? So that's something that's on my mind. Also, kind of related, another point, and this is getting more granular than the sort of overall the overall outcomes, but you had mentioned partnering with PG&E on lessening the impacts of the public safety power shutoffs. One of the real perverse outcomes of PG&E's woes has been that people, in an effort to prevent power shutoffs, have been buying diesel-powered generators, and PG&E actually even facilitates that. If you go to their website, they will help you buy a diesel-powered generator. Yeah. So I don't have any brilliant policy solutions on how to address that, but if increased wildfires, and they're not going anywhere, they're only getting worse, right? I don't think anybody has much faith in PG&E's ability to harden their entire system and prevent these shutdowns, though they did a better job this year than last year. That's something that I think needs to be addressed. More and more people are going to get more and more sick of this and turn that way.
Yeah, real quick, I wanted to chime in regarding policy. Have you guys reached out to Berkeley's Cool Climate Network at all to look at their research and get their thoughts on, because I know they have a whole section on municipal codes, and I see you nodding, Sammy, so I'm assuming that's a yes.
Yeah. So we,
Awesome.
we definitely have worked with them in the past, the Cool Climate Network, and with, at Berkeley too. And they are, I think what's really great about them, and we're not really focusing on it so much here, but maybe, it's something we can look at in the future, is their consumption-based inventories. So not only looking at, what the emissions are as a result of consuming energy and driving our cars in the city, but also the things that we purchase, the food that we eat, the travel that we do beyond driving. So they have some really interesting tools for that, to kind of defining a carbon footprint beyond what we already look at. But yeah, they're a great resource. So thanks, Jenny.
Absolutely. Yeah, just with people talking about the high impacts, policies, and not be sure quite where to turn, that seems like it could at least be a good starting point for us to be looking at in terms of shaping, especially with all the new tools that I've started seeing them put up there. Because there's a lot of things like that we can do, for instance, like incentives to get buy-in from the city. I think a lot of people, maybe it'll be hard to switch away from natural gas, but certainly there's, as living in a building that's been here since the 50s, there's a lot of things that we can do and incentives we can provide that I think would be extremely beneficial for people. Just like even basic things like weatherproofing. We don't have any insulation in our roof. I just discovered that by looking in the crawl space. So just little things like that can reduce energy usage even without, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that I think would benefit people a lot as well. So.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, I think I also wrote the health and environmental justice section, and I know for housing, I have weatherproofing programs and other things to provide support for folks. And I know, John, you've been muted for a while. Do you have any feedback for us?
Thank you. Well, it's funny, Sammy asked you what we're feeling. First of all, I'm incredibly impressed with this committee and how knowledgeable people are. Because what I'm feeling is, I think we have this consensus, yes, we want to be an environmental leader and we want to get there through a lens of environmental justice. What I'm really struggling with, and I think it was being alluded to earlier, is I have no sense of what things really matter. Like this whole natural gas thing is, I'd sort of vaguely heard about it before tonight and now hearing about it. And, I don't feel like I'm in a position to be able to really weigh in on, it's a good idea, it's a bad idea. Yeah, we ought to push it. No, we ought to go for transportation. I don't, and I'm trying to figure out in our level at this committee, or this council, like, what are we being asked to do? Are we being asked to set the goal? And then I know the devil's in the details, but the details will be figured out later. Or are we supposed to be actually starting to guide how we would get there? And if we are, I think I need to just learn more. I don't feel like I'm in a position right now to really say that, yeah, you know what, transportation is the way we ought to go. That's where our biggest bang is, versus no, we got to get rid of natural gas, versus no, we got to do a whole bunch of little things. So that's where I'm sitting now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think just, a quick answer is if our goal is carbon neutral or carbon negative, we need to, adopt an all of the above kind of approach. So that means addressing transportation, that means addressing new construction, that means addressing existing buildings. And I think that, based on the emissions profile that we are working from, transportation and buildings are the largest contributors to emissions. So those are really the two sectors where I think we have the most opportunity to reduce emissions. But then how we do that is still up for debate. And it's important because greenhouse gas reductions is really only one part of it. We want to bring in the equity. We want to make sure that we're allowing for, a growing economy within the city. So really balancing all these different ideas is really important in how we prioritize the measures. And like I said before, this is only the beginning of the conversation. Diana said there will be, future opportunities to provide feedback maybe once we've gotten a little bit further down the process. And then also the CAP process, we'll be doing some outreach there. So we'll have, more quantitative analysis to show you how these measures actually impact greenhouse gases. So that's all to come. So I think it's great that, you see that it is a very complex question. And I think that it's really nice to hear that, we all need a little more information about these things, and hopefully we can provide that in the future.
Yeah, and I think this is the third policy framework that we've shared with you all. I feel like we did economic development and we did transportation, and now we're moving on to here. And so we want to hear all of your feedback, because we're at the point where we've developed these frameworks, and as we're checking in with city departments and we're checking in with Scavenger, we're getting some instances where they're saying like, oh, like we had never thought of that, or you're missing this, maybe you should include this. And so we're coming to you to see if there's anything that you see that we're missing, if you see any gaps, and also to hear what you're leaning towards, just so we can start gathering your feedback so we can go back to the city and go back to the community. And so I don't want you to feel pressured like this is this final opportunity for feedback. And also if you make a decision and then you end up changing your mind a few months down the line, it'll be too late. It's not one of those instances.
John,
but thank you for sharing. I know this is a lot of information. And Billy?
I was going to say, John, I think your question actually is one that staff has a lot as well, of how do you measure the impacts, or how do you get to the implementation of all of these different goals when some of them are competing? And so once council selected the preferred land use scenario, now the consultant team is starting to get into the analysis that helps us to answer a lot of these questions. And so like, I think the bigger thing this evening becomes is it carbon neutral versus carbon negative, or those level of questions, because as Sammy said, what buttons you might have to push become a little bit different depending on what that goal is. But I think we have that so on the climate action standpoint, in the zoning standpoint or the land use competition standpoint, it's, for instance, how do we have it so residential can compete with industrial or biotech if they're going to be allowed in the same general zoning districts? And so there's a lot of different analysis that'll be happening over the next few months that hopefully will allow us to look at all of these questions together at some point once we have all of that data. And we'll be able to come back to you, staff, ourselves will also be getting kind of just high level look at the data to say, okay, what are the trade-offs? Because you're right, like we could pick a certain number here, say we want to do 2040, well, here's the impacts that's going to have. And as a community, we'll have to say, we're fine with that. Like we'd rather have this impacted development if we can become carbon neutral at an earlier time frame. But hopefully we'll have enough data to help us look at all of those questions with a little bit more clear vision of what the actual impacts are. But right now it's more the high level to make sure we're just going down the right path.
And then Nick, I see you have your hand up. Is there something you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, I think to speak to John's point, I think I had the same kind of questions and concerns. I think it would be useful if somehow we can convert these kind of different options on a kind of a cost effectiveness basis, cost however you define it, resources, time, but that way you have a kind of an easy comparison to say, well, how much bang do you get from natural gas versus transportation versus the ease it would take to implement. So that's one kind of question or request I would have. And the other one thing I think I just thought about that's kind of missing, we're thinking, solar panels and, battery chargers and gray water, but we get a lot of wind here. And, now they're improving these kind of vertical wind turbines. So I can see in the next 20 years at some point having a kind of efficient wind turbine in people's backyard. And the vertical nature, there's less noise, but it's certainly going to be some noise associated with that. So I don't know if you've considered it, if we want to also think about that and at least capture that so we can project 20 years in the future where people might be having wind turbines in their backyards.
Yeah, we can definitely explore that further too. Okay, so I just wanted, we have about 20 minutes left. So one of the things that I really wanted to touch on are this last question here. So, I know biotech is a really big part of South San Francisco and pretty unique to the city. So are there special considerations that biotech should be given? Are there, a set of priorities that the city is looking to, in terms of biotech? So I just thought it might be good to get some, ideas around how should we treat biotech, especially, knowing that they have a particular set of I guess, operational needs and, they have R&D and all these other things. So I just wanted to get your opinions on that topic as well.
I think Bob had a question.
Yes, I think to have better success with getting the public to buy in on the carbon neutral is through education, getting them to want to do it versus forcing them to do it. So showing the benefits of converting your home to all electric, both for heating your water, heating your home, cooking with it, and so on and so forth. I think we'll have better success when we can educate the public on the benefits to them personally, and they'll want to do it rather than being forced to. I think we'll have a better chance of success in meeting our goals when the public is buying in on this, knowing that there is a benefit directly to them as well as the environment.
And then I had a question, and I'm sorry, but it's for Sophie actually. And I'm curious if on the biotech question, if Genentech has a master plan, I believe, and if their master plan or any of the other biotechs have like carbon neutral or carbon reduction goals in them, and what they are.
Yeah, I can't speak to any of the other biotechs out there. Yeah, Genentech does have pretty aggressive carbon emission reduction goals. Genentech is actually is owned by Roche, which is a larger pharmaceutical company based in Switzerland. So these goals actually apply to the entire global Roche network, not just the South San Francisco site. But yeah, we do have a zero intention to be to have zero carbon emissions. I want to say by 2050 across the whole network. Don't quote me on that because I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there's a pretty aggressive, the most aggressive timeline is actually in the next 10 years, and then kind of getting the rest of the way will follow. But yeah, I mean, speaking to sort of the general challenges for Genentech, there are many because, you know, unlike most of the other biotech companies in South San Francisco, we're still manufacturing medicine here in South City, in addition to just the R&D lab functions, which, as you might imagine, uses a lot of energy. We're transitioning a lot of our manufacturing practices and are ultimately going to have to look at transitioning away from natural gas. That's going to be a gigantic hurdle. But something that, you know, we know is necessary and that we're prepared to do. But even, I mean, I would just thinking about sort of the question in general, I think, frankly, well, again, our electricity and biotechs in South San Francisco's electricity sourcing is more or less taken care of through participating in Peninsula Clean Energy, which is great. It's really the natural gas usage, not just for manufacturing, but in the labs, is big. And frankly, the water usage is the other major component, both in manufacturing and in lab work. So looking at, you know, looking at new best practices and ways to reduce water use, of course, you know, figures directly into these same sustainability goals as well. One other thing to think about that's been on my mind a lot recently, and it's a little bit of a sort of a secondary effect, but I think is important for this group to keep in mind, is actually going back to the issue of transportation, which is that while many people in the professional sector post-COVID may still continue to work remotely, at least part-time. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about, you know, the ability of that trend to reduce traffic and reduce VMT. That's, I mean, again, I'm speaking just from the biotech standpoint. This applies to many, many other jobs too, right? But there's a huge portion of jobs for whom that's not going to be the case. And perhaps, unfortunately, for South San Francisco and the biotech cluster, you know, you can't run your experiments in your kitchen. Maybe some people try to, but given that so much of South San Francisco's professional employment base is in biotech, that's not actually a sector that will see a huge amount of reduction in VMT because it's a fewer percentage of those people who can work from home. Even throughout the whole pandemic, Genentech has continued to have people on site, not our full employee population, but a lot of people on site the whole time. So just that's another consideration, you know, if we're thinking about biotech and the ramifications of having such a large biotech sector in South San Francisco. It's not just the energy and water use, it actually, there's a transportation connection there as well.
You know, when we,
Oh, go ahead, Julian.
when we talk about like, should biotech have some considerations? I think, you know, definitely yes. And also, you know, we had a pretty big discussion when we were doing land use about maintaining manufacturing and industrial uses in South San Francisco. And we were all pretty enthusiastic that we retain that as part of our identity. And so I think we also need to think about making special considerations for those uses. And whether this is like somehow an overlay district or something to address that, you know, not everyone's going to be able to participate in these programs and policies and goals. And just a question, I guess, for staff, for Billy. I don't know if now the city requires, when there's construction waste or demolition waste, if we require recycling or salvage before diverting to garbage, you know, to waste. And if not, I think that's a good policy to think about implementing, especially as we see more demolition and renovation. And if we're, you know, asking people to update all of their homes to be electric, we're going to have a bunch of waste to consider what to do with. So just something to think about policy wise.
The city actually has had a construction and demolition debris recycling ordinance for quite a while. I think it's actually relatively typical for a lot of municipalities now. But obviously we can look at does it need to be increased from what we currently have. The other thing I was going to say, just for the kind of considerations for biotech and such, what we typically find, and I agree with Sophie, like Genentech's somewhat of a unique, because they're doing a lot of this for themselves, where a lot of our other biotech development is done through kind of biotech developers, and then different companies are coming into those places. But typically what we hear from the development community, they know that these types of requirements are coming down. And so they're on board with them. They just want to know when they start the process, what all of the different requirements are, so they have the ability to determine what all the costs are going to be and can plan their projects that way. So as long as the city is upfront with the requirements, then the developers typically are able to figure out how to incorporate all of that so that they can still make these projects financially feasible. It's when we move the goalposts during the process that it becomes more problematic.
I just wanted to chime in real quick as well, just as a citizen outside of the advisory as well. But speaking to the special considerations, I think that we should be very cautious in resisting the impulse to give a lot of special considerations to industries, especially ones that are such a core part of our identity. I think there is often, and I see cities kind of get nervous about the potential of losing business and negotiate against themselves a bit. So while I'm not absolutely not against giving special considerations on a case by case as needed basis, if it's deemed to be really necessary for the developer, I think that we shouldn't have that be our starting point in the negotiations. Be my recommendation.
Yeah, I would agree personally. I think that one way in which we can potentially try to address some of these challenges in a way that doesn't seem as though it's, unreasonably giving one particular industry a break or setting different standards for one versus another, is to think a little bit more objectively, maybe by land use type. As Julianne was saying, it's manufacturing does not just apply to biotech. There's other manufacturing uses. There's other warehousing uses. It might be just as difficult for a manufacturer of who knows what to transition as it is for drug manufacturing, right? So if we say, well, this is a set of standards that make sense for residential uses, this is a set of standards that make sense for for this type of commercial use, this type of industrial use, and so on, then you're doing it kind of more on a performance basis than on like a business type basis.
Yeah, Jenny, I'm just reading your comment too about exceptions in the code and everything. And I think once we get, these are all really great points, and I'm really glad we had a chance to talk about this. And when we get to the actual crafting of policies or ordinances, we can really dive into what, you know, how we should handle some of these special considerations, if at all. So thank you so much for you know, providing your feedback and your input. I think this was, I hope you guys really enjoyed this, you know, conversation. And again, this is just a starting place. So thank you guys. And Diana, I'm going to hand it back to you to go over the next steps.
Perfect. Okay, if you can go on to the next slide. So we just wanted to give you a quick update on where we are next. We are right in between initiating the EIR and zoning and policy frameworks. We initiated the EIR, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? It's up on the website, so you can read the notice. And we also have an environmental impact report public scoping meeting on the 17th of February. We have been working on these policy frameworks, as you've been seeing. You've gotten a look at 3. We've also been meeting with the city, as Billy has been mentioning, and we are going to have community conversations starting on March 15th. From March 15th to March 31st, we're going to have 11 community meetings. Most of them are going to be in the evenings. We have a handful that are going to be in the afternoon, like at 11 o'clock. And they're going to be, if you go to the next slide, on all of these topics. So on land use, on mobility, climate adaptation and hazard safety, health, environmental justice, and social equity. We'll have parks and conservation together, and we'll have greenhouse gas mitigation and sustainability together. And then we'll have one for downtown, Lindenville, and east of 101. And so the way we're framing this is, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have these community meetings. We're going to have primer videos so people can watch a brief, like 3 to 4 minute video if they don't attend the meeting, so that they can get oriented on what greenhouse gas emissions are, or what do we mean when we say social equity, so that then they can take a look at the policies. And these policy documents are going to be about 5 to 7 pages, where we lay out what we heard from community feedback, what we found during boosting conditions, and laying out the outcomes, the performance metrics, and the different policies and actions that we have related to goals. And so we're going to have those documents open for about a month, and we're going to be getting feedback from you all, and we're going to take that back, make updates, and present it to the city. And if you go back again, Sammy. Yeah. And I do also want to mention that we've already jump-started the zoning. And so that's an ongoing process. And we're also, now that we've completed the greenhouse gas reduction, an initial analysis, we're going to be jumping into the climate action plan as well. So you'll be noticing that there will be a few more opportunities for outreach along the way. And we're starting to connect a lot of these policies. And Billy, did you want to add anything else?
No, it's, I'll just say it's, we thought it was a lot going on last year. Now, when you actually start to get into how you implement all these things, find out that it's 2021 is going to be a bit crazy in the amount of work with all of this. It's exciting times to be able to figure out how to implement the vision.
And we'll be sending out information to the committee members once we have those dates finalized, which should be any day now. So that you can attend as many as you want.
And you can also watch all of the recordings in that same way, and we will have interpretation available at each one of them, and we'll have separate focus groups in Spanish. Does anyone have any final questions on this timeline or any other next steps? Okay, well, thank you so much. Passing it back to you, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, this is the time for staff comments. I'll start it off, and then Billy and Tony, if you have anything to add. The City Council, I think I mentioned at a previous meeting, did ask that we do recruitment for a District 5 committee member. And so the city clerk has started that recruitment process now for a CAC member to represent that area. And I'll forward that information to the committee. So if you can help us, if you have, any friends that live in District 5, help us with that recruitment process. We'd really appreciate it. And I'll also send you the information on the scoping meeting. And the intent of that, if you're not familiar, is to gather input on what the scope of the environmental impact report analyzing the EIR should include. So we're going to look at the normal issues of transportation and, greenhouse gases, and there's a lot of other areas, but we want to make sure the community also has an opportunity to input on any items they would like addressed in the environmental impact analysis. And then finally, once we have those dates selected for the community meetings, we'll email you as well to let you know when those are. Billy, Tony, anything you'd like to add?
Nothing. You got all of my items.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say thank you, for the hard questions and the conversation. This is an overwhelming topic, and this is the first step to start working through what a response to climate change and sea level rise and all the things facing our generation and our children. So I really appreciate the conversation. Thanks, Sammy and Diana, Dean.
Okay, does any committee members have any comments?
All I can say is thanks. It was a great discussion.
Great. Okay, I think that we are adjourned at 8:01. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Bye.
All right.